You're about to hear the full, chilling tale of the murders in the Rue Morgue, a crime so bizarre, so impossible, it defied all logic. This is the audiobook you clicked for, by the master of the macabre, Edgar Allan Poe. Imagine Paris, 1841. Two women, brutally murdered, their bodies found in a locked room on the 4th floor. No escape, no discernible motive. The police are utterly baffled. How could anyone commit such an atrocity and vanish into thin air? This isn't just any crime story. It's the very birth of detective fiction, a genre invented by Poe himself. You'll witness the unparalleled intellect of Auguste Dupin as he dissects every impossible detail. But what he uncovers isn't just surprising, it's truly unbelievable. Get ready to have your understanding of crime and its perpetrators completely turned on its head. We've meticulously crafted this solo narration to bring Poe's genius to life with clarity and grand pacing, perfect for modern listeners. So settle in and prepare to have your mind stretched. If you love unraveling a good mystery, please like this video, leave a comment with your initial theories, and subscribe for more classic tales. The murders in the Rue Morgue. The mental features we call analytical are, in themselves, difficult to analyze. We understand them only through their effects. For instance, when a person possesses them to an extraordinary degree, they become a source of intense enjoyment. Just as a strong person delights in their physical ability, enjoying exercises that challenge their muscles, so the analyst glories in the mental activity that disentangles problems. He finds pleasure even in the most trivial tasks that engage his talent. He enjoys enigmas, riddles, and hieroglyphics. In solving each, he displays an acumen that seems supernatural to the average person. His solutions, born from the very essence of method, appear to be pure intuition. The ability to solve problems is likely strengthened by mathematical study, especially by its highest branch, which, somewhat unfairly and only because of its backward operations, has been called analysis as if it were the ultimate form. Yet, to calculate is not, in itself, to analyze. A chess player, for example, calculates without necessarily analyzing. Therefore, the game of chess, in its effects on mental character, is greatly misunderstood. I am not writing a treatise here, but merely introducing a rather unusual narrative with some random observations. I will, however, take this opportunity to state that the higher powers of the reflective intellect are more thoroughly and usefully challenged by the unassuming game of checkers than by all the elaborate triviality of chess. In chess, with its pieces having different and strange movements and varied and changing values, what is only complex is often mistaken for what is profound, a common error. Here, attention is powerfully engaged. If it lapses for an instant, an oversight occurs, leading to harm or defeat. Since the possible moves are not only numerous but intricate, the chances of such oversights are multiplied. In 9 out of 10 cases, the more focused player, rather than the more acute, wins. In checkers, on the other hand, where the moves are simple and have little variation, the chances of error are reduced. Since mere attention is less occupied, any advantages gained by either player come from superior acumen. To be less abstract, imagine a game of checkers with only 4 kings. In this scenario, no oversight is to be expected. It is clear that victory can only be decided, if the players are equally matched, by some intricate move, the result of a strong intellectual effort. Deprived of ordinary resources, the analyst puts himself in his opponent's shoes, identifies with them, and often sees at a glance the only methods, sometimes absurdly simple ones, by which he can lead the opponent into error or miscalculation. Whist has long been recognized for its influence on what is called the calculating power. Men of the highest intellect have been known to take an apparently inexplicable delight in it, while avoiding chess as frivolous. Without a doubt, nothing else of a similar nature so greatly exercises the faculty of analysis. The best chess player in Christendom may be little more than just that. But proficiency in whist implies a capacity for success in all those more important endeavors where one mind contends with another. When I say proficiency, I mean that perfection in the game includes understanding all the sources from which legitimate advantage can be gained. These sources are not only numerous but varied, and often lie in depths of thought entirely inaccessible to the ordinary mind. To observe attentively is to remember distinctly. So far, the focused chess player will do well at whist. The rules of Hoyle, which are based on the mere mechanics of the game, are sufficiently and generally understandable. Thus, having a good memory and playing by the book are commonly considered the hallmarks of good play. But the analyst's skill is evident in matters beyond the limits of mere rules. He makes, in silence, a host of observations and inferences. Perhaps his companions do too, but the difference in the extent of information obtained lies not so much in the validity of the inference as in the quality of the observation. The necessary knowledge is knowing what to observe. Our player does not limit himself at all, nor, because the game is the object, does he reject deductions from things external to the game. He examines his partner's expression, carefully comparing it with that of each of his opponents. He considers how the cards are arranged in each hand, often counting trump by trump and honor by honor through the glances their holders cast upon them. He notes every change of expression as the play progresses, gathering a wealth of information from the differences in certainty, surprise, triumph, or chagrin. From the way a trick is gathered, he judges whether the person taking it can make another in the same suit. He recognizes a feint by how the card is thrown onto the table. A casual or accidental word, the accidental dropping or turning of a card with the accompanying anxiety or carelessness about concealing it, the counting of tricks with the order of their arrangement, embarrassment, hesitation, eagerness, or trepidation, all provide, to his seemingly intuitive perception, indications of the true state of affairs. After the first 2 or 3 rounds have been played, he fully knows the contents of each hand, and from then on, plays his cards with as absolute a precision of purpose as if the others had shown him their hands. Analytical power should not be confused with mere ingenuity. While the analyst is necessarily ingenious, an ingenious person is often remarkably incapable of analysis. The constructive or combining power, by which ingenuity is usually manifested, and to which phrenologists erroneously, I believe, have assigned a separate organ, supposing it a primitive faculty, has been so frequently seen in those whose intellect otherwise bordered on idiocy, that it has attracted general observation among writers on morals. Between ingenuity and analytical ability, there is a far greater difference, indeed, than that between fancy and imagination, but their character is very strictly analogous. In fact, it will be found that the ingenious are always fanciful, and the truly imaginative are never anything but analytical. The narrative that follows will appear to the reader somewhat like a commentary on the propositions just presented. Residing in Paris during the spring and part of the summer of 18, I became acquainted with a Monsieur C. Auguste Dupin. This young gentleman came from an excellent, indeed an illustrious, family. However, due to a series of unfortunate events, he had been reduced to such poverty that his character's energy succumbed to it. He ceased to exert himself in the world or care about recovering his fortune. Through the courtesy of his creditors, a small remnant of his inheritance still remained in his possession. From the income it provided, he managed, through a rigorous economy, to procure life's necessities without bothering himself about luxuries. Books, indeed, were his sole luxury, and in Paris, these are easily obtained. Our first meeting was at an obscure library in the Rue Montmartre. We were both searching for the same very rare and remarkable volume, which brought us into closer communion. We met again and again. I was deeply interested in the brief family history he recounted to me with all the candor a Frenchman displays when he speaks of himself. I was also astonished by the vast extent of his reading. Above all, I felt my soul ignited by the wild fervor and vivid freshness of his imagination. As I sought my own pursuits in Paris, I felt that the company of such a man would be a priceless treasure, and I frankly confided this feeling to him. It was eventually arranged that we would live together during my stay in the city. Since my financial circumstances were somewhat less strained than his, I was permitted to bear the expense of renting and furnishing a time-worn and grotesque mansion. It had long been deserted due to superstitions we did not inquire about, and was tottering to its fall in a secluded and desolate part of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. Its rather fantastic gloom suited our shared temperament. Had the routine of our life in this place been known to the world, we would have been considered madmen, though perhaps harmless ones. Our seclusion was perfect. We admitted no visitors. Indeed, the location of our retreat had been carefully kept secret from my own former associates. Many years had passed since Dupin had ceased to know or be known in Paris. We existed solely within ourselves. It was a whim of my friend, for what else shall I call it, to be enamored of the night for its own sake. And into this eccentricity, as into all his others, I quietly fell, giving myself up to his wild whims with complete abandon. The darkness would not always dwell with us naturally, but we could imitate its presence. At the first hint of morning, we closed all the grimy shutters of our old building, lighting a couple of strongly perfumed tapers that cast only the ghastliest and faintest rays. By their aid, we then immersed ourselves in dreams, reading, writing, or conversing, until the clock warned us of the true arrival of darkness. Then we sallied forth into the streets arm in arm, continuing the day's topics, or roaming far and wide until a late hour. Amidst the wild lights and shadows of the populous city, we sought that endless mental excitement which quiet observation can provide. At such times, I could not help but notice and admire Dupin's peculiar analytic ability, even though his rich imagination had prepared me to expect it. He seemed to take an eager delight in its exercise, if not exactly in its display, and did not hesitate to confess the pleasure he derived from it. He boasted to me with a low chuckling laugh that most men, in relation to him, wore windows in their chests. He would often follow up such assertions with direct and startling proofs of his intimate knowledge of my own thoughts. His manner at these moments was cold and detached. His eyes were blank, while his voice, usually a rich tenor, rose into a treble that would have sounded petulant were it not for the deliberate and perfectly distinct enunciation. Observing him in these moods, I often mused upon the old philosophy of the bipart soul, and entertained myself with the fancy of a double Dupin, the creative and the problem-solving. Let it not be supposed, from what I have just said, that I am detailing any mystery or writing any romance. What I have described in The Frenchman was merely the result of an excited, or perhaps a diseased, intelligence. But an example of the character of his remarks at these times will best convey the idea. One night, we were strolling down a long, dirty street near the Palais Royal. Both of us were apparently lost in thought, neither having spoken a word for at least 15 minutes. All at once, Dupin spoke these words. "He is a very little fellow, that's true, and would do better for the Théâtre de Variétés." "There can be no doubt of that," I replied unwittingly, not at first noticing, so absorbed was I in reflection, the extraordinary way in which the speaker had chimed in with my thoughts. An instant later, I collected myself, and my astonishment was profound. "Dupin," I said gravely, "this is beyond my comprehension. I do not hesitate to say that I am amazed and can scarcely believe my senses. How is it possible that you knew I was thinking of?" Here I paused, to be absolutely sure he truly knew of whom I thought. "Of Chantilly," he said. "Why do you pause?" "You were remarking to yourself that his diminutive figure unfitted him for tragedy." This was precisely what had occupied my thoughts. Chantilly was a former cobbler from the Rue Saint-Denis who, obsessed with the stage, had attempted the role of Xerxes in Crebellin's tragedy of that name, and had been famously ridiculed for his efforts. "Tell me, for heaven's sake," I exclaimed, "the method, if there is one, by which you have managed to fathom my soul in this matter." In fact, I was even more startled than I was willing to express. "It was the fruiterer," replied my friend, "who led you to the conclusion that the mender of Sauls was not tall enough for Xerxes and all such roles." "The fruiterer? You astonish me. I know no fruiterer whatsoever." "The man who ran into you as we entered the street. It may have been 15 minutes ago." I now remembered that, in fact, a fruiterer, carrying a large basket of apples on his head, had accidentally nearly knocked me down as we passed from the Rue C. into the thoroughfare where we stood. But what this had to do with Chantilly, I could not possibly understand. There was not a particle of charlatanism about Dupin. "I will explain," he said, "and so that you may comprehend everything clearly, we will first retrace the course of your meditations, from the moment I spoke to you until the encounter with the fruiterer in question. The major links of the chain run thus: Chantilly, Orion, Dr. Nichols, Epicurus, stereotomy, the street stones, the fruiterer. Few people have not, at some point in their lives, amused themselves by retracing the steps through which their own minds reached particular conclusions. The activity is often fascinating, and he who attempts it for the first time is astonished by the seemingly limitless distance and incoherence between the starting point and the goal. What, then, must have been my amazement when I heard the Frenchman speak what he had just spoken, and when I could not help acknowledging that he had spoken the truth. He continued, "We had been talking about horses, if I remember correctly, just before leaving the Rue C. This was the last subject we discussed. As we crossed into this street, a fruiterer, with a large basket on his head, brushed quickly past us, pushing you onto a pile of paving stones collected where the roadway was under repair. You stepped on one of the loose fragments, slipped, slightly strained your ankle, appeared vexed or sulky, muttered a few words, turned to look at the pile, and then proceeded in silence. I was not particularly attentive to what you did, but observation has become with me, lately, a kind of necessity. You kept your eyes on the ground, glancing with a petulant expression at the holes and ruts in the pavement, so I saw you were still thinking of the stones, until we reached the little alley called Lamartine, which had been paved as an experiment with overlapping and riveted blocks. Here your countenance brightened, and seeing your lips move, I had no doubt you murmured the word stereotomy, a term very effectively applied to this type of pavement. I knew you could not say stereotomy to yourself without being led to think of atomies, and thus of the theories of Epicurus. Since, not long ago when we discussed this subject, I mentioned how singularly, yet with how little notice, the vague guesses of that noble Greek had been confirmed in the late nebular cosmogony, I felt you could not avoid casting your eyes upward to the great nebula in Orion, and I certainly expected that you would do so. You did look up, and I was now certain I had correctly followed your steps. But in that bitter tirade about Chantilly, which appeared in yesterday's Musée, the satirist, making some disgraceful allusions to the cobbler's change of name upon adopting the tragic actor's boot, quoted a Latin line about which we have often conversed. I mean the line, "Perdidit antiquum littera prima sonum." I had told you that this referred to Orion, formerly written Urion, and from certain pointed remarks connected with this explanation, I was aware that you could not have forgotten it. It was clear, therefore, that you would not fail to combine the two ideas of Orion and Chantilly. That you did combine them, I saw by the character of the smile that passed over your lips. You thought of the poor cobbler's mockery. So far, your gait had been stooping, but now I saw you draw yourself up to your full height. I was then sure you reflected upon Chantilly's diminutive figure. At this point, I interrupted your meditations to remark that as, in fact, he was a very little fellow, that Chantilly, he would do better at the Théâtre de Variétés. Not long after this, we were looking over an evening edition of the Gazette de Tribunaux, when the following paragraphs caught our attention. Extraordinary murders. This morning, about 3 o'clock, the inhabitants of the Quartier Saint-Roch were awakened from sleep by a succession of terrifying shrieks, apparently coming from the 4th story of a house in the Rue Morgue. This house was known to be solely occupied by a Madame L'Espanaye and her daughter, Mademoiselle Camille L'Espanaye. After some delay, caused by a fruitless attempt to gain entry in the usual manner, the gateway was broken in with a crowbar, and 8 or 10 of the neighbors entered, accompanied by 2 gendarmes. By this time, the cries had ceased, but as the party rushed up the first flight of stairs, 2 or more rough voices in angry contention were distinguished and seemed to come from the upper part of the house. As the second landing was reached, these sounds also ceased, and everything remained perfectly quiet. The party spread out and hurried from room to room. Upon arriving at a large back chamber on the 4th story, the door of which, found locked with the key inside, was forced open, A spectacle presented itself that struck everyone present with no less horror than astonishment. The apartment was in the wildest disorder, the furniture broken and thrown about in all directions. There was only one bedstead, and from this, the bed had been removed and thrown into the middle of the floor. On a chair lay a razor, smeared with blood. On the hearth were 2 or 3 long and thick tresses of gray human hair, also dabbled in blood, and seemingly pulled out by the roots. On the floor were found 4 Napoleons, a topaz earring, 3 large silver spoons, 3 smaller ones of metal d'Alger, and 2 bags containing nearly 4,000 francs in gold. The drawers of a bureau, which stood in one corner, were open and had apparently been ransacked, although many articles still remained in them. A small iron safe was discovered under the bed, not under the bedstead. It was open, with the key still in the door. It contained nothing beyond a few old letters and other papers of little consequence. Of Madame L'Espanaye, no traces were seen here, but an unusual quantity of soot was observed in the fireplace, so a search was made in the chimney. And, horrible to relate, the corpse of the daughter, head downward, was dragged therefrom, having been thus forced up the narrow opening for a considerable distance. The body was quite warm. Upon examining it, many abrasions were noticed, no doubt caused by the violence with which it had been thrust up and dislodged. On the face were many severe scratches, and on the throat, dark bruises and deep indentations of fingernails, as if the deceased had been throttled to death. After a thorough investigation of every part of the house, without further discovery, the group made its way into a small paved yard at the rear of the building. There lay the corpse of the old lady, her throat so completely severed that when they tried to lift her, her head fell off. Both the body and the head were fearfully mutilated, the body so much so that it barely retained any semblance of humanity. To this horrible mystery, we believe there is not yet the slightest clue. The next day's paper had these additional details. The tragedy in the Rue Morgue. Many individuals have been questioned in relation to this most extraordinary and frightful affair. The word affair has not yet, in France, the light-hearted meaning it conveys with us, but nothing whatever has emerged to shed light upon it. We provide below all the material testimony gathered. Pauline Dubourg, laundress, states that she has known both the deceased for 3 years, having washed for them during that period. The old lady and her daughter seemed on good terms, very affectionate towards each other. They paid excellent wages. She could not speak about their lifestyle or means of living. She believed Madame L, told fortunes for a living, and was rumored to have money saved. She never met any other persons in the house when she called for or delivered clothes. She was sure they had no servants employed. There appeared to be no furniture in any part of the building except on the 4th story. Pierre Moreau, tobacconist, states that he has been selling small quantities of tobacco and snuff to Madame L'Espanaye for nearly 4 years. He was born in the neighborhood and has always resided there. The deceased and her daughter had occupied the house where the corpses were found for more than 6 years. It was formerly occupied by a jeweler who sublet the upper rooms to various people. The house belonged to Madame L. She became dissatisfied with her tenant's misuse of the premises and moved into it herself, refusing to rent any portion. The old lady was childlike. The witness had seen the daughter some 5 or 6 times during the 6 years. The two lived an exceedingly secluded life and were reputed to have money. He had heard it said among the neighbors that Madame L told fortunes. He did not believe it. He had never seen anyone enter the door except the old lady and her daughter, a porter once or twice, and a physician some 8 or 10 times. Many other people, neighbors, gave similar testimony. No one was mentioned as frequenting the house. It was not known whether Madame L and her daughter had any living relatives. The shutters of the front windows were seldom opened. Those in the rear were always closed, except for the large back room on the 4th story. The house was a good house, not very old. Isidore Muset, gendarme, states that he was called to the house about 3 o'clock in the morning and found some 20 or 30 people at the gateway, trying to gain admittance. He finally forced it open with a bayonet, not with a crowbar. He had little difficulty opening it because it was a double or folding gate, bolted neither at the bottom nor the top. The shrieks continued until the gate was forced, and then suddenly ceased. They seemed to be screams of someone or some people, in great agony. They were loud and prolonged, not short and quick. The witness led the way upstairs. Upon reaching the first landing, he heard two voices in loud and angry contention, one a gruff voice, the other much shriller, a very strange voice. He could distinguish some words from the former, which was that of a Frenchman. He was positive that it was not a woman's voice. He could distinguish the words sacre and diable. The shrill voice was that of a foreigner. He could not be sure whether it was the voice of a man or a woman. He could not make out what was said, but believed the language to be Spanish. The state of the room and the bodies was described by this witness as we described them yesterday. Henri Duval, a neighbor and a silversmith by trade, states that he was one of the party who first entered the house. He generally corroborates Muset's testimony. As soon as they forced an entrance, they reclosed the door to keep out the crowd, which gathered very quickly, despite the late hour. This witness thinks the shrill voice was that of an Italian. He was certain it was not French. He could not be sure that it was a man's voice. It might have been a woman's. He was not acquainted with the Italian language. He could not distinguish the words, but was convinced by the intonation that the speaker was Italian. He knew Madame L. and her daughter and had conversed with both frequently. He was sure that the shrill voice was not that of either of the deceased. Odenheimer, restaurateur. This witness volunteered his testimony. Not speaking French, he was examined through an interpreter. He is a native of Amsterdam. He was passing the house at the time of the shrieks. They lasted for several minutes, probably 10. They were long and loud, very awful and distressing. He was one of those who entered the building. He corroborated the previous evidence in every respect but one. He was sure that the shrill voice was that of a man, of a Frenchman. He could not distinguish the words uttered. They were loud and quick, uneven, spoken apparently in fear as well as in anger. The voice was harsh, not so much shrill as harsh. He would not call it a shrill voice. The gruff voice repeatedly said sacre, diable, and once mon Dieu. Jules Mignaud, banker, of the firm of Mignaud et Fils, Rue de Lorraine. He is the elder Mignaud. Madame L'Espanaye had some property. She had opened an account with his banking house in the spring of the year, 8 years previously. She made frequent small deposits. She had not withdrawn anything until the 3rd day before her death, when she personally took out the sum of 4,000 francs. This sum was paid in gold, and a clerk went home with the money. Adolphe Le Bon, clerk to Mignaud et Fils, states that on the day in question, about noon, he accompanied Madame L'Espanaye to her residence with the 4,000 francs, packaged in 2 bags. Upon the door being opened, Mademoiselle L. appeared and took one of the bags from his hands, while the old lady relieved him of the other. He then bowed and departed. He did not see anyone in the street at the time. It is a side street, very lonely. William Bird Taylor states that he was one of the party who entered the house. He is an Englishman and has lived in Paris for 2 years. He was one of the first to ascend the stairs. He heard the voices in contention. The gruff voice was that of a Frenchman. He could make out several words, but cannot now remember all. He distinctly heard sacre and mon Dieu. There was a sound at that moment as if several people were struggling, a scraping and scuffling sound. The shrill voice was very loud, louder than the gruff one. He is sure that it was not the voice of an Englishman. It appeared to be that of a German. It might have been a woman's voice. He does not understand German. 4 of the above-named witnesses, being recalled, stated that the door of the chamber where Mademoiselle L.'s body was found was locked on the inside when the party reached it. Everything was perfectly silent, no groans or noises of any kind. Upon forcing the door, no person was seen. The windows, both of the back and front rooms, were down and firmly fastened from within. A door between the 2 rooms was closed but not locked. The door leading from the front room into the passage was locked, with the key on the inside. A small room at the front of the house, on the 4th story, at the head of the passage, was open, the door being ajar. This room was crowded with old beds, boxes, and so forth. These were carefully removed and searched. Not an inch of any portion of the house was left unsearched. Sweeps were sent up and down the chimneys. The house was a 4-story one, with garrets, mansards. A trapdoor on the roof was nailed down very securely. It did not appear to have been opened for years. The time between hearing the voices in contention and the breaking open of the room door was variously stated by the witnesses. Some made it as short as 3 minutes, some as long as 5. The door was opened with difficulty. Alfonso Garcio, undertaker, states that he resides in the Rue Morgue. He is a native of Spain. He was one of the party who entered the house. He did not proceed upstairs. He is nervous and was apprehensive of the consequences of agitation. He heard the voices in contention. The gruff voice was that of a Frenchman. He could not distinguish what was said. The shrill voice was that of an Englishman. He is sure of this. He does not understand the English language, but judges by the intonation. Alberto Montani, confectioner, states that he was among the first to ascend the stairs. He heard the voices in question. The gruff voice was that of a Frenchman. He distinguished several words. The speaker appeared to be expostulating. He could not make out the words of the shrill voice. It spoke quickly and unevenly. He thinks it was the voice of a Russian. He corroborates the general testimony. He is an Italian. He has never conversed with a native of Russia. Several witnesses recalled here testified that the chimneys of all the rooms on the 4th story were too narrow to admit the passage of a human being. By sweeps were meant cylindrical sweeping brushes, such as are employed by those who clean chimneys. These brushes were passed up and down every flue in the house. There is no back passage by which anyone could have descended while the party proceeded upstairs. The body of Mademoiselle L'Espanaye was so firmly wedged in the chimney that it could not be removed until 4 or 5 of the party combined their strength. Paul Dumas, physician, states that he was called to view the bodies about daybreak. They were both then lying on the mattress of the bedstead in the chamber where Mademoiselle L. was found. The corpse of the young lady was very bruised and abrasive. The fact that it had been thrust up the chimney would sufficiently account for these appearances. The throat was greatly chafed. There were several deep scratches just below the chin, along with a series of livid spots that were evidently finger impressions. The face was fearfully discolored, and the eyeballs protruded. The tongue had been partially bitten through. A large bruise was discovered upon the pit of the stomach, produced, apparently, by the pressure of a knee. In the opinion of Monsieur Dumas, Mademoiselle L'Espanaye had been throttled to death by some unknown person or persons. The mother's corpse was horribly mutilated. All the bones of the right leg and arm were more or less shattered. The left tibia was much splintered, as were all the ribs on the left side. The whole body was dreadfully bruised and discolored. It was not possible to say how the injuries had been inflicted. A heavy wooden club, a broad iron bar, a chair, any large, heavy, and blunt weapon would have produced such results if wielded by a very powerful man. No woman could have inflicted such blows with any weapon. The deceased's head, when seen by the witness, was entirely separated from the body and was also greatly shattered. The throat had evidently been cut with some very sharp instrument, probably a razor. Alexander Etienne, surgeon, was called with Monsieur Dumas to view the bodies. He corroborated Monsieur Dumas's testimony and opinions. Nothing further of importance was elicited, although several other persons were examined. A murder so mysterious and so perplexing in all its particulars was never before committed in Paris, if indeed a murder has been committed at all. The police are entirely at fault, an unusual occurrence in affairs of this nature. There is not, however, the shadow of a clue apparent. The evening edition of the paper stated that the greatest excitement still continued in the Quartier Saint-Roch, that the premises in question had been carefully researched, and fresh examinations of witnesses had been instituted, but all to no purpose. A postscript, however, mentioned that Adolphe Le Bon had been arrested and imprisoned, although nothing appeared to incriminate him, beyond the facts already detailed. Dupin seemed uniquely interested in the progress of this affair, at least, so I judged from his manner, for he made no comments. It was only after the announcement that Le Bon had been imprisoned that he asked me my opinion regarding the murders. I could only agree with all of Paris in considering them an insoluble mystery. I saw no means by which it would be possible to trace the murderer. "We must not judge the means," said Dupin, "by this superficial examination. The Parisian police, so highly praised for their shrewdness, are cunning, but nothing more. There is no method in their proceedings beyond the method of the moment. They make a grand show of their methods, but often these are so ill-suited to their intended purpose that they remind us of Monsieur Jourdain calling for his dressing gown. Pour mieux entendre la musique, to hear the music better. The results they achieve are often surprising, but for the most part, they are brought about by simple diligence and activity. When these qualities fail, their schemes fail. Vidocq, for example, was a good guesser and a persevering man. But, without educated thought, he continually erred by the very intensity of his investigations. He impaired his vision by holding the object too close. He might see, perhaps, 1 or 2 points with unusual clarity, but in doing so, he necessarily lost sight of the matter as a whole. Thus, there is such a thing as being too profound. Truth is not always in a well. In fact, regarding the more important knowledge, I do believe that it is invariably superficial. The depth lies in the valleys where we seek her, and not upon the mountain tops where she is found. The ways and sources of this kind of error are well illustrated by observing heavenly bodies. To look at a star fleetingly, to view it sideways by turning the outer portions of the retina towards it, which are more susceptible to faint light impressions than the inner, is to see the star distinctly. It is to have the best appreciation of its luster, a luster which grows dim precisely as we turn our vision fully upon it. A greater number of rays actually fall upon the eye in the latter case, but in the former there is a more refined capacity for comprehension. By undue profundity, we perplex and weaken thought. It is possible to make even Venus herself vanish from the firmament by a scrutiny too sustained, too concentrated, or too direct. As for these murders, let us conduct some examinations for ourselves before we form an opinion about them. An inquiry will amuse us. I thought this an odd term, so applied, but said nothing, and besides, Le Bon once rendered me a service for which I am not ungrateful. We will go and see the premises with our own eyes. I know G, the prefect of police, and shall have no difficulty obtaining the necessary permission. The permission was obtained, and we immediately went to the Rue Morgue. This is one of those dismal thoroughfares that lie between the Rue Richelieu and the Rue Saint-Roch. It was late afternoon when we reached it, as this quarter is a great distance from where we resided. The house was easily found, for many people were still gazing up at the closed shutters, with an aimless curiosity, from the opposite side of the street. It was an ordinary Parisian house with a gateway. On one side was a glazed watchbox, with a sliding panel in the window, indicating a concierge's lodge. Before going in, we walked up the street, turned down an alley, and then turning again, passed behind the building. Dupin, meanwhile, examined the entire neighborhood, as well as the house, with a minuteness of attention for which I could see no possible purpose. Retracing our steps, we came again to the front of the dwelling. We rang, and having shown our credentials, were admitted by the agents in charge. We went upstairs into the chamber where Mademoiselle L'Espanaye's body had been found, and where both the deceased still lay. The disorder of the room had, as usual, been left undisturbed. I saw nothing beyond what had been stated in the Gazette des Tribunaux. Dupin scrutinized everything, not excluding the bodies of the victims. We then went into the other rooms and into the yard, a gendarme accompanying us throughout. The examination occupied us until dark, when we departed. On our way home, my companion stopped for a moment at the office of one of the daily papers. I have said that my friend's whims were many, and that les ménagiers, a French phrase for which there is no direct English equivalent, but which implies humoring or indulging them. It was his humor, now, to decline all conversation on the subject of the murder until about noon the next day. He then asked me, suddenly, if I had observed anything peculiar at the scene of the atrocity. There was something in his manner of emphasizing the word peculiar that caused me to shudder, without knowing why. No, nothing peculiar, I said. Nothing more, at least, than we both saw stated in the paper. "The Gazette," he replied, "has not, I fear, grasped the unusual horror of the thing, but dismissed the idle opinions of this print. It seems to me that this mystery is considered insoluble for the very reason that should make it easy to solve, for the outrageous character of its features. The police are confused by the seeming absence of motive, not for the murder itself, but for the atrocity of the murder. They are puzzled, too, by the apparent impossibility of reconciling the voices heard in contention with the facts that no one was found upstairs but the murdered Mademoiselle L'Espanaye, and that there was no means of exit without being noticed by the ascending party. The wild disorder of the room, the corpse thrust head downward up the chimney, the frightful mutilation of the old lady's body, these considerations, with those just mentioned, and others I need not mention, have sufficed to paralyze the powers, by completely baffling the boasted shrewdness of the government agents. They have fallen into the gross but common error of confusing the unusual with the abstruse. But it is by these deviations from the plane of the ordinary that reason finds its way, if at all, in its search for the truth. In investigations such as we are now pursuing, one should not so much ask what has occurred, as what has occurred that has never occurred before. In fact, the ease with which I shall arrive, or have arrived, at the solution of this mystery is directly proportional to its apparent insolubility in the eyes of the police. I stared at the speaker in mute astonishment. "I am now awaiting," he continued, looking toward the door of our apartment, "a person who, while perhaps not the perpetrator of these butcheries, must have been in some measure involved. Of the worst portion of the crimes, it is probable that he is innocent. I hope I am right in this supposition, for upon it I build my expectation of reading the entire riddle. I look for the man here, in this room, every moment. It is true that he may not arrive, but the probability is that he will. Should he come, it will be necessary to detain him. Here are pistols, and we both know how to use them when occasion demands." I took the pistols, scarcely knowing what I did, or believing what I heard, while Dupin went on, very much as if in a soliloquy. I have already spoken of his abstract manner at such times. His discourse was addressed to myself, but his voice, although by no means loud, had that intonation commonly employed in speaking to someone at a great distance. His eyes, vacant in expression, regarded only the wall. That the voices heard in contention, he said, by the party upon the stairs, were not the voices of the women themselves, was fully proved by the evidence. This relieves us of all doubt upon the question of whether the old lady could have first destroyed her daughter and afterward committed suicide. I speak of this point chiefly for the sake of method, for Madame L'Espanaye's strength would have been utterly unequal to the task of thrusting her daughter's corpse up the chimney as it was found, and the nature of the wounds upon her own person entirely precludes the idea of self-destruction. Murder, then, has been committed by some third party, and the voices of this third party were those heard in contention. Let me now advertise, not to the whole testimony respecting these voices, but to what was peculiar in that testimony. Did you observe anything peculiar about it? I remarked that while all the witnesses agreed in supposing the gruff voice to be that of a Frenchman, there was much disagreement regarding the shrill, or, as one individual termed it, the harsh voice. "That was the evidence itself," said Dupin, "but it was not the peculiarity of the evidence. You have observed nothing distinctive. Yet there was something to be observed. The witnesses, as you remark, agreed about the gruff voice. They were here unanimous. But in regard to the shrill voice, the peculiarity is not that they disagreed, but that, while an Italian, an Englishman, a Spaniard, a Hollander, and a Frenchman attempted to describe it, each one spoke of it as that of a foreigner. Each is sure that it was not the voice of one of his own countrymen. Each likens it, not to the voice of an individual of any nation with whose language he is conversant, but the converse. The Frenchman supposes it the voice of a Spaniard, and might have distinguished some words had he been acquainted with Spanish. The Dutchman maintains it to have been that of a Frenchman, but we find it stated that, not understanding French, this witness was examined through an interpreter. The Englishman thinks it is the voice of a German, and does not understand German. The Spaniard is sure that it was that of an Englishman, but judges by the intonation altogether, as he has no knowledge of English. The Italian believes it is the voice of a Russian, but has never conversed with a native of Russia. A second Frenchman differs, moreover, with the first, and is positive that the voice was that of an Italian, but not being cognizant of that tongue, is, like the Spaniard, convinced by the intonation. Now, how strangely unusual must that voice have really been, about which such testimony as this could have been elicited, in whose tones even denizens of the 5 great divisions of Europe could recognize nothing familiar. You will say that it might have been the voice of an Asiatic, of an African. Neither Asiatics nor Africans abound in Paris, but without denying the inference, I will now merely call your attention to 3 points. The voice is termed by one witness harsh rather than shrill. It is represented by 2 others to have been quick and unequal. No words, no sounds resembling words, were by any witness mentioned as distinguishable. I know not, continued Dupin, what impression I may have made, so far, upon your own understanding, but I do not hesitate to say that legitimate deductions, even from this portion of the testimony, the portion respecting the gruff and shrill voices, are in themselves sufficient to engender a suspicion which should give direction to all further progress in the investigation of the mystery. I said legitimate deductions, but my meaning is not thus fully expressed. I design to imply that the deductions are the sole proper ones, and that the suspicion arises inevitably from them as the single result. What the suspicion is, however, I will not say just yet. I merely wish you to bear in mind that, with myself, it was sufficiently forceful to give a definite form, a certain tendency, to my inquiries in the chamber. Let us now transport ourselves, in fancy, to this chamber. What shall we first seek here? The means of egress employed by the murderers. It is not too much to say that neither of us believes in supernatural events. Madame and Mademoiselle L'Espanaye were not destroyed by spirits. The doers of the deed were material, and escaped materially. Then how? Fortunately, there is but one mode of reasoning upon the point, and that mode must lead us to a definite decision. Let us examine, each by each, the possible means of egress. It is clear that the assassins were in the room where Mademoiselle L'Espanaye was found, or at least in the adjoining room, when the party ascended the stairs. It is then only from these 2 apartments that we have to seek exits. The police have laid bare the floors, the ceilings, and the masonry of the walls in every direction. No secret exits could have escaped their vigilance. But, not trusting their eyes, I examined them on my own. There were, then, no secret exits. Both doors leading from the rooms into the passage were securely locked, with the keys inside. Let us turn to the chimneys. These, although of ordinary width for some 8 or 10 feet above the hearths, will not admit, throughout their extent, the body of a large cat. The impossibility of egress by means already stated, being thus absolute, we are reduced to the windows. Through those of the front room no one could have escaped without notice from the crowd in the street. The murderers must have passed, then, through those of the back room. Now, brought to this conclusion in such an unequivocal manner as we are, it is not our part, as reasoners, to reject it on account of apparent impossibilities. It is only left for us to prove that these apparent impossibilities are, in reality, not such. There are 2 windows in the chamber. One of them is unobstructed by furniture, and is wholly visible. The lower portion of the other is hidden from view by the head of the unwieldy bedstead, which is thrust close up against it. The former was found securely fastened from within. It resisted the utmost force of those who endeavored to raise it. A large gimlet hole had been pierced in its frame to the left, and a very stout nail was found fitted therein, nearly to the head. Upon examining the other window, a similar nail was seen similarly fitted in it, and a vigorous attempt to raise this sash failed also. The police were now entirely satisfied that egress had not been in these directions, and therefore it was thought a matter of supererogation to withdraw the nails and open the windows. My own examination was somewhat more particular, and was so for the reason I have just given, because here it was, I knew, that all apparent impossibilities must be proved to be not such in reality. I proceeded to think thus, a posteriori. The murderers did escape from one of these windows. This being so, they could not have refastened the sashes from the inside, as they were found fastened, the consideration which put a stop, through its obviousness, to the scrutiny of the police in this quarter. Yet the sashes were fastened. They must, then, have the power of fastening themselves. There was no escape from this conclusion. I stepped to the unobstructed casement, withdrew the nail with some difficulty, and attempted to raise the sash. It resisted all my efforts, as I had anticipated. A concealed spring must, I now know, exist, and this corroboration of my idea convinced me that my premises, at least, were correct, however mysterious still appeared the circumstances attending the nails. A careful search soon brought to light the hidden spring. I pressed it, and, satisfied with the discovery, forbore to upraise the sash. I now replaced the nail and regarded it attentively. A person passing out through this window might have reclosed it, and the spring would have caught, but the nail could not have been replaced. The conclusion was plain, and again narrowed the field of my investigations. The assassins must have escaped through the other window. Supposing, then, the springs upon each sash to be the same, as was probable, there must be found a difference between the nails, or at least between the modes of their fixture. Getting upon the sacking of the bedstead, I looked over the headboard minutely at the second casement. Passing my hand down behind the board, I readily discovered and pressed the spring, which was, as I had supposed, identical in character with its neighbor. I now looked at the nail. It was as stout as the other, and apparently fitted in the same manner, driven in nearly up to the head. You will say that I was puzzled, but if you think so, you must have misunderstood the nature of the inductions. To use a sporting phrase, I had not once been at fault. The scent had never for an instant been lost. There was no flaw in any link of the chain. I had traced the secret to its ultimate result, and that result was the nail. It had, I say, in every respect, the appearance of its fellow in the other window, but this fact was an absolute nullity, conclusive as it might seem to be, when compared with the consideration that here, at this point, terminated the clue. There must be something wrong, I said, about the nail. I touched it, and the head, with about 1/4 of an inch of the shank, came off in my fingers. The rest of the shank was in the gimlet hole where it had been broken off. The fracture was an old one, for its edges were encrusted with rust, and had apparently been accomplished by the blow of a hammer, which had partially embedded, in the top of the bottom sash, the head portion of the nail. I now carefully replaced this head portion in the indentation whence I had taken it, and the resemblance to a perfect nail was complete. The fissure was invisible. Pressing the spring, I gently raised the sash for a few inches. The head went up with it, remaining firm in its bed. I closed the window, and the semblance of the whole nail was again perfect. The riddle, so far, was now unriddled. The assassin had escaped through the window, which looked upon the bed. Dropping of its own accord upon his exit, or perhaps purposely closed, it had become fastened by the spring, and it was the retention of this spring which had been mistaken by the police for that of the nail, further inquiry being thus considered unnecessary. The next question is that of the mode of descent. Upon this point I had been satisfied in my walk with you around the building. About 5½ feet from the casement in question, there runs a lightning rod. From this rod it would have been impossible for anyone to reach the window itself, to say nothing of entering it. I observed, however, that the shutters of the 4th story were of the peculiar kind called by Parisian carpenters ferrades, a kind rarely employed at the present day, but frequently seen upon very old mansions at Lyons and Bordeaux. They are in the form of an ordinary door, a single, not a folding door, except that the lower half is latticed or worked in open trellis, thus affording an excellent hold for the hands. In the present instance these shutters are fully 3½ feet broad. When we saw them from the rear of the house, they were both about half open, that is to say, they stood off at right angles from the wall. It is probable that the police, as well as myself, examined the back of the tenement, but if so, in looking at these ferrades in the line of their breadth, as they must have done, they did not perceive this great breadth itself, or, at all events, failed to take it into due consideration. In fact, having once satisfied themselves that no egress could have been made in this quarter, they would naturally bestow here a very cursory examination. It was clear to me, however, that the shutter belonging to the window at the head of the bed would, if swung fully back to the wall, reach to within 2 feet of the lightning rod. It was also evident that, by exertion of a very unusual degree of activity and courage, an entrance into the window from the rod might have been thus effected. By reaching to the distance of 2.5 feet, we now suppose the shutter open to its whole extent. A robber might have taken a firm grasp upon the trellis work. Letting go, then, his hold upon the rod, placing his feet securely against the wall, and springing boldly from it, he might have swung the shutter so as to close it, and if we imagine the window open at the time, might even have swung himself into the room. I wish you to bear especially in mind that I have spoken of a very unusual degree of activity as requisite to success in such a hazardous and so difficult feat. It is my design to show you, first, that the thing might possibly have been accomplished. But secondly and chiefly, I wish to impress upon your understanding the very extraordinary, the almost supernatural character of that agility which could have accomplished it. You will say, no doubt, using the language of the law, that to make out my case, I should rather undervalue than insist upon a full estimation of the activity required in this matter. This may be the practice in law, but it is not the usage of reason. My ultimate object is only the truth. My immediate purpose is to lead you to place in juxtaposition that very unusual activity of which I have just spoken with that very peculiar shrill, or harsh, and unequal voice, about whose nationality no 2 persons could be found to agree, and in whose utterance no syllabification could be detected. At these words a vague and half-formed conception of Dupin's meaning flitted over my mind. I seemed to be upon the verge of comprehension without the power to comprehend, as men, at times, find themselves upon the brink of remembrance without being able, in the end, to remember. My friend went on with his discourse. "You will see," he said, "that I have shifted the question from the mode of egress to that of ingress. It was my design to convey the idea that both were effected in the same manner, at the same point. Let us now revert to the interior of the room. Let us survey the appearances here. The drawers of the bureau, it is said, had been rifled, although many articles of apparel still remained within them. The conclusion here is absurd. It is a mere guess, a very silly one, and no more. How are we to know that the articles found in the drawers were not all these drawers had originally contained? Madame L'Espanaye and her daughter lived an exceedingly retired life, saw no company, seldom went out, had little use for numerous changes of clothing. Those found were at least of as good quality as any likely to be possessed by these ladies. If a thief had taken any, why did he not take the best? Why did he not take all? In a word, why did he abandon 4,000 francs in gold to encumber himself with a bundle of linen? The gold was abandoned. Nearly the whole sum mentioned by Monsieur Mignaud, the banker, was discovered in bags upon the floor. I wish you, therefore, to discard from your thoughts the blundering idea of motive, engendered in the brains of the police by that portion of the evidence which speaks of money delivered at the door of the house. Coincidences 10 times as remarkable as this, the delivery of the money, and murder committed within 3 days upon the party receiving it, happen to all of us every hour of our lives, without attracting even momentary notice. Coincidences, in general, are great stumbling blocks in the way of that class of thinkers who have been educated to know nothing of the theory of probabilities, that theory to which the most glorious objects of human research are indebted for the most glorious of illustration. In the present instance, had the gold been gone, the fact of its delivery 3 days before would have formed something more than a coincidence. It would have been corroborative of this idea of motive. But, under the real circumstances of the case, if we are to suppose gold was the motive of this outrage, we must also imagine the perpetrator so vacillating as to have abandoned his gold and his motive together. As the sailor looked in, the gigantic animal had seized Madame L'Espanaye by the hair, which was loose as she had been combing it, and was flourishing the razor about her face in imitation of the motions of a barber. The daughter lay prostrate and motionless. She had swooned. The screams and struggles of the old lady, during which the hair was torn from her head, had the effect of changing the probable pacific purposes of the orang-outang into those of wrath. With one determined sweep of its muscular arm, it nearly severed her head from her body. The sight of blood inflamed its anger into frenzy. Gnashing its teeth and flashing fire from its eyes, it flew upon the body of the girl and embedded its fearful talons in her throat, retaining its grasp until she expired. Its wandering and wild glances fell at this moment upon the head of the bed, over which the face of its master, rigid with horror, was just discernible. The fury of the beast, who no doubt bore still in mind the dreaded whip, was instantly converted into fear. Conscious of having deserved punishment, it seemed desirous of concealing its bloody deeds, and skipped about the chamber in an agony of nervous agitation, throwing down and breaking the furniture as it moved, and dragging the bed from the bedstead. In conclusion, it seized first the corpse of the daughter and thrust it up the chimney as it was found, then that of the old lady, which it immediately hurled through the window headlong. As the ape approached the casement with its mutilated burden, the sailor shrank aghast to the rod, and, rather gliding than clambering down it, hurried at once home, dreading the consequences of the butchery, and gladly abandoning, in his terror, all solicitude about the fate of the orang-outang. The words heard by the party upon the staircase were the Frenchman's exclamations of horror and affright, commingled with the fiendish jabberings of the brute. I have scarcely anything to add. The orang-outang must have escaped from the chamber, by the rod, just before the breaking of the door. It must have closed the window as it passed through it. It was subsequently caught by the owner himself, who obtained for it a very large sum at the Jardin des Plantes. Lubon was instantly released, upon our narration of the circumstances, with some comments from Dupin, at the bureau of the prefect of police. This functionary, however well disposed to my friend, could not altogether conceal his chagrin at the turn which affairs had taken, and was fain to indulge in a sarcasm or two about the propriety of every person minding his own business. "Let him talk," said Dupin, who had not thought it necessary to reply. "Let him discourse, it will ease his conscience. I am satisfied with having defeated him in his own castle." Nevertheless, that he failed in the solution of this mystery is by no means that matter for wonder which he supposes it, for, in truth, our friend the prefect is somewhat too cunning to be profound. In his wisdom is no stamen. It is all head and no body, like the pictures of the goddess Laverna, or, at best, all head and shoulders like a codfish. But he is a good creature after all. I like him especially for one master stroke of cant, by which he has attained his reputation for ingenuity. I mean the way he has to deny what is and to explain what is not.